The wind howled through the frozen valley, carrying with it the whispers of an unforgiving winter. Snowflakes danced wildly in the night sky, falling like soft feathers, but their beauty masked the bitter cold that could freeze bones. Inside a small wooden cabin, nestled at the edge of the village, Thomas, an old man with tired blue eyes, sat hunched in his rocking chair. His frail fingers, roughened by years of labor, held a tin cup filled with lukewarm tea. The fire in the hearth crackled weakly, its glow casting long shadows on the wooden walls. He pulled his tattered wool blanket closer, but the chill still seeped into his bones. His breath came out in soft white puffs, disappearing into the dimly lit room. He had lived in this cabin for over 20 years, but this winter felt colder than any before. At his feet lay Buddy, his golden furred dog, curled up tightly. Buddy's large, expressive brown eyes flickered open now and then, glancing at Thomas as if sensing his unease. "Another storm's coming, boy," Thomas murmured, his voice hoarse with age. He reached down with a trembling hand and gently scratched behind Buddy's ears. The dog responded by thumping his tail against the wooden floor, his way of saying, "I'm here. You're not alone." Thomas sighed, leaning back in his chair. He wasn't afraid of the storm. He wasn't afraid of the cold. What haunted him was the silence, the empty space beside him where his wife once sat, the untouched chair by the fireplace that once belonged to his son. They were both gone. His wife, Margaret, had passed away a decade ago, taken by a sickness they couldn't afford to treat. His son, Daniel, had left soon after, searching for a life beyond the frozen village. He had promised to write, to visit, but the years stretched on, and no letters ever came. Thomas was alone. Alone, except for Buddy. The old man looked down at the dog, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Buddy had come into his life when everything felt hopeless. A memory of hope. It had been 6 years since Thomas had found Buddy, or rather since Buddy had found him. A particularly harsh winter had settled over the village. Thomas had been out in the woods searching for firewood when he heard it, a faint, desperate whimper coming from beneath a fallen tree trunk. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him, but then another whimper, weaker this time. Curious, Thomas had crouched down and pushed aside the frozen branches, and there, half buried in the snow, was a tiny golden puppy, shivering violently. Thomas had hesitated. He had barely enough food for himself. Taking in a stray meant another mouth to feed. But then the pup had opened its eyes, deep brown, full of silent pleas, and Thomas, despite his stubborn nature, couldn't walk away. He had tucked the tiny creature inside his coat and carried him home. That night, by the fire, he had fed the pup a small bowl of broth and held him close, feeling the rapid heartbeat against his chest. From that moment on, they belonged to each other. Thomas had named him Buddy, and as the years passed, the once tiny puppy grew into a strong, loyal dog who never left his side. Buddy became his family. The weight of age. But now Thomas wasn't the same man he had been 6 years ago. His bones ached with every movement. His breath felt shorter. His body, once strong from years of working the land, was now failing him. He rarely left the cabin anymore. Even chopping firewood had become a struggle. Buddy, ever watchful, seemed to understand. The dog had started bringing small logs from the pile outside, dropping them near the hearth. He would nudge Thomas's hands gently whenever the old man sat too long without eating, and at night, when the cold felt unbearable, Buddy would press against him, sharing his warmth. But no matter how much Buddy tried to help, Thomas knew his time was running out. He could feel it in his chest, a deep exhaustion that sleep never cured, a weakness that no amount of rest could fix, and he feared what would happen to Buddy when he was gone. Who would take care of him? Who would love him the way he deserved? A sharp gust of wind rattled the windows, pulling Thomas from his thoughts. He exhaled slowly and reached down, running a hand over Buddy's thick fur. "You'll be okay, boy," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince Buddy or himself. The dog lifted his head and licked Thomas's fingers gently, his eyes filled with a silent promise. "I won't let anything happen to you." Outside, the storm was gathering. The wind howled louder, snowflakes swirling angrily against the wooden walls. Winter had come with full force, and in the days to come, it would test the strength of a bond that even death could not break. The storm outside had grown fiercer. Snow slammed against the windows like ghostly hands trying to break in. The wind howled through the narrow cracks of the wooden cabin, making eerie whistles that sent shivers down Thomas's spine. Inside, the fire flickered weakly, barely keeping the cold at bay. Despite Buddy's warmth beside him, Thomas felt a deep chill creeping into his bones, a chill that wasn't just from the weather. He coughed, a deep, raspy sound that echoed in the quiet room. His chest felt tight, as if an invisible weight pressed down on him. He took a sip of the now cold tea in his hands, hoping it would soothe the ache in his throat, but it did nothing. Buddy lifted his head, ears twitching. His deep brown eyes studied Thomas with quiet concern. "I'm fine, boy," Thomas muttered, though the words felt hollow even to himself. Buddy didn't believe him. He never did when Thomas lied about his health. The dog sat up, sniffing the air, then let out a low whimper, nudging Thomas's knee. Thomas smiled faintly, reaching down to scratch Buddy's head. The simple act of touching his loyal companion brought him comfort. But comfort wouldn't change the truth. His body was failing him. A storm unlike any other. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped dangerously low. Even inside the cabin, Thomas could see his own breath in the dim light of the fire. He struggled to stand, every movement slow and painful. He needed more firewood. The small stack beside the hearth was nearly gone, and without it, they wouldn't last the night. Grabbing his thick coat, Thomas shuffled toward the door. Buddy immediately stood up, his tail stiff. "I'll be right back," Thomas assured him, but Buddy let out a soft growl, stepping in front of the door. It was as if the dog was warning him not to go outside. But Thomas had no choice. Without fire, they would freeze. He gently pushed Buddy aside and pulled the door open. A blast of icy wind and swirling snow nearly knocked him off his feet. The cold hit him like a punch to the chest, stealing the breath from his lungs. He squinted against the storm, stepping outside into the knee-deep snow. Each step was a struggle. His legs felt heavy, his breath came in ragged gasps. The firewood pile was just a few feet away, but it felt like miles. Behind him, Buddy barked anxiously from the doorway. "I'm okay," Thomas called over the wind, though his voice was barely a whisper. He reached the woodpile and bent down, his fingers numb as he grabbed a few logs. But as he straightened up, a sharp pain shot through his chest. His vision blurred. The world tilted. And then, darkness. A friend's desperation. Buddy barked frantically as Thomas collapsed into the snow, unmoving. The dog rushed to his side, nudging his face, licking his hands, trying to wake him. But Thomas didn't stir. His face was pale, his lips slightly blue from the cold. Buddy whimpered, circling around him, his paws sinking into the snow. His human, his only family, was dying, and Buddy wouldn't let that happen. An impossible decision. Buddy had never left Thomas's side before, not once in 6 years, but now he had to. The village was far, the storm was deadly, but if Buddy didn't get help, Thomas wouldn't make it through the night. With one last nuzzle to Thomas's motionless form, Buddy turned and ran. He ran into the blizzard, his paws crunching through the thick snow, his body shivering from the cold. The wind howled, pushing against him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. His heart pounded, his breath came in short puffs, but he kept going, driven by one thought: he had to save Thomas. A faint light in the distance. Hours passed. The cold gnawed at Buddy's body, his fur coated in ice. He was exhausted, but still he ran. And then he saw it. A faint light glowing in the distance. A cabin. Summoning the last of his strength, Buddy let out a deep, desperate howl into the night. Inside the cabin, Jack, a local hunter, was just about to fall asleep when he heard it. A howl, loud, sorrowful, desperate. Frowning, Jack grabbed his coat and rifle, stepping onto his porch. His eyes scanned the white landscape, and then he saw Buddy, his golden fur barely visible beneath the snow, his legs shaking. Jack hurried forward. "Buddy, what are you doing out here, boy?" Buddy barked, running in circles, then darting toward the trees before stopping and barking again. Jack immediately understood. Something was wrong. Grabbing a lantern, he followed Buddy into the storm. The journey back to Thomas's cabin was brutal. The snow was thick, the wind blinding, but Jack pushed forward, following Buddy's desperate barks. Finally, they arrived. Jack rushed toward the motionless figure in the snow. "Thomas!" He dropped to his knees, feeling for a pulse. It was weak. but it was there. Without wasting another second, Jack hoisted the old man onto his back. Buddy stayed close, his nose pressed against Thomas's cold fingers. "Hang in there, old man," Jack muttered, adjusting his grip. "We're getting you inside." Buddy whined, pressing against Jack's legs as if urging him to hurry. They had one last chance to save Thomas, and Buddy wouldn't leave his side. Thomas drifted between darkness and light. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the wind howling. He could feel the biting cold pressing against his skin. But there was something else too, a warmth, a familiar presence, a soft whimper, a gentle weight pressed against his chest. Buddy, his loyal companion, his friend. Thomas tried to open his eyes, but his body refused to move. He felt trapped between two worlds, one pulling him into an endless sleep, the other begging him to wake up. And then, a voice, gruff but urgent. "Come on, old man, stay with me!" A hand gripped his wrist, shaking him gently. Thomas tried to respond, but his throat was too dry, his body too weak. He wasn't sure how long he'd been lying in the snow before Jack found him. Minutes? Hours? Time had blurred into a cold, endless void. The cabin of salvation. When Thomas finally managed to open his eyes, the first thing he saw was firelight. The warm glow flickered across the wooden walls, casting moving shadows. The heat from the fireplace seeped into his bones, melting away the iciness that had nearly claimed his life. He was wrapped in thick blankets, his body still aching but no longer numb. And beside him, curled up so close that their bodies touched, was Buddy. The golden-furred dog lifted his head the moment Thomas stirred. His big brown eyes, usually filled with mischief, were now clouded with worry. He let out a soft whimper, nudging Thomas's arm gently. A weak smile tugged at the old man's lips. "Hey, boy," Thomas murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. His throat felt raw, his chest heavy, but he was alive. Buddy wagged his tail, pressing his nose against Thomas's face, licking away the last traces of cold. Jack's voice came from across the room. "You almost didn't make it." Thomas turned his head slowly and saw Jack sitting on a wooden stool, arms crossed, his rugged face lined with concern. Jack had always been a man of few words, a hunter who kept to himself, much like Thomas. They weren't exactly friends, but they understood each other in the way that only lonely men do. "How?" Thomas's voice cracked. Jack sighed, leaning back. "Your dog." Thomas frowned slightly. Jack continued, nodding toward Buddy. "He ran through the storm, found me at my cabin, and led me straight to you. If it weren't for him..." He paused, shaking his head. "You wouldn't be here, old man." Thomas looked at Buddy again, his vision blurring, not from exhaustion but from something else, something deeper. "You saved me, didn't you, boy?" His voice trembled with emotion. Buddy wagged his tail but didn't move from his spot beside Thomas. He had no intention of leaving his side. Not now. Not ever. Jack stood up and walked over to the fire, adding more wood. The flames roared to life, filling the cabin with warmth. "You've got a fever?" Jack said over his shoulder. "Probably from being out in the cold too long. You need rest." Thomas nodded weakly. His entire body ached, but the warmth of the blankets and the rhythmic sound of Buddy's breathing helped soothe his pain. Jack grabbed a tin cup from the small wooden table and poured something into it. "Here, drink this." Thomas struggled to sit up, but even that simple movement drained his energy. His hands shook as he reached for the cup, but before he could grasp it, Buddy did something surprising. The dog gently pressed his body against Thomas's arm, steadying him. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Buddy knew Thomas was weak, and he was there to support him. Jack raised an eyebrow, smirking slightly. "That dog of yours, he's something special." Thomas took a sip of the warm broth, the heat spreading through him. "He always has been." Jack nodded. "You should have seen him, Thomas. Running through that storm, howling like his life depended on it. It was like..." He paused, shaking his head as if struggling to find the right words. Like he knew exactly what he was doing. Like he understood that if he didn't find help, you'd... He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. Thomas already knew. Buddy had made a choice to risk his own life to save him, and that choice had saved them both. Chash, a life worth living. The next few days were spent recovering. Thomas was too weak to return home, so Jack insisted he stay until he regained his strength. Buddy never left his side. Every morning, the dog would wake up before Thomas, watching him with careful eyes, as if making sure he was still breathing. Every night, Buddy curled up beside him, pressing close to keep him warm. And every moment in between, he was there, silent, loyal, unwavering. Jack noticed it too. "I've seen a lot of dogs in my time," he said one evening as he cleaned his rifle by the fire, "but I've never seen one love someone the way Buddy loves you." Thomas chuckled weakly, running a hand over Buddy's thick fur. "That's because he's not just a dog." Jack smirked. "No, he's not." Thomas looked down at his loyal companion. "He's family." Buddy thumped his tail against the floor, resting his head on Thomas's lap. For the first time in years, Thomas felt something he thought he had lost: purpose. He had spent so long waiting for the end, believing he had nothing left to live for. But Buddy had proven him wrong, because love, true love, the kind that doesn't ask for anything in return, never fades. And as long as Buddy was with him, Thomas wasn't ready to give up. Not yet, not ever. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the land. The once raging blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world covered in soft white snow. The sky was clearer, the winds calmer, and the days a little longer. Inside Jack's cabin, Thomas sat by the fire, wrapped in a thick woolen blanket. He was still weak, but his strength was returning, and beside him, as always, was Buddy. The dog had not left his side even once. Every time Thomas stirred in his sleep, Buddy's ears would perk up. Every time Thomas coughed, Buddy would press his warm body closer, as if to shield him from the cold. Jack, watching from the kitchen, shook his head with a smirk. "That dog of yours is something else." Thomas smiled faintly, scratching Buddy behind the ears. "Yeah, he is." Buddy wagged his tail, resting his head on Thomas's lap. For him, the world was simple. As long as Thomas was safe, he was happy. Returning home, after a few more days of rest, Thomas finally felt strong enough to return to his own cabin. Jack, being the practical man he was, tried to convince him to move into town. "You're not as young as you used to be, Thomas. This winter nearly took you. What if Buddy hadn't found me?" Thomas chuckled. "Then I'd probably be warming a spot in the afterlife right now." Jack didn't laugh. "I'm serious." Thomas sighed, looking down at Buddy, who was watching their conversation with curious eyes. Then he smiled. He wasn't afraid of dying anymore, but he also wasn't ready to leave Buddy just yet. "I'll be fine," Thomas said firmly. "Buddy won't let anything happen to me." Jack sighed but didn't argue. He knew there was no changing Thomas's mind. So after bundling up in warm clothes, Thomas and Buddy set off toward home. A new beginning. The journey back was slow but peaceful. The snow crunched under Thomas's boots, the crisp winter air filled his lungs, and Buddy walked close to his side, ever watchful. When they finally reached the cabin, Thomas let out a deep breath. It was still the same, small, worn, but filled with memories. Buddy barked happily and bounded toward the porch, tail wagging. He was home. Thomas followed, chuckling. "You're more excited than I am, boy." The cabin was cold and dark inside, but within minutes, Thomas had a fire roaring in the hearth. The warmth spread through the tiny space, chasing away the last remnants of the storm. He sat down in his old rocking chair, sighing in contentment. Buddy curled up beside him, resting his head on Thomas's feet. For the first time in a long time, Thomas didn't feel alone. Seasons change, but love remains. The days turned into weeks. Winter gave way to spring. The snow melted, revealing patches of green. Birds returned to the trees, singing their songs of new beginnings. Thomas regained his strength, though he was still slower than before. His hands trembled sometimes, his breaths were shorter, but he didn't complain. He had Buddy. The dog followed him everywhere, into the woods, down to the frozen lake, even when Thomas went to chop firewood. One afternoon, as Thomas sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, Buddy rested his head on his lap. "You saved my life," Thomas murmured, scratching behind Buddy's ears. "I don't think I ever said thank you." Buddy looked up at him with deep brown eyes full of warmth. He didn't need words. His loyalty spoke louder than any thank you ever could. Thomas smiled. "You're a good boy." Buddy wagged his tail, pressing closer. The final winter. Years passed. Buddy grew older, his golden fur speckled with gray. His steps weren't as quick, and his once energetic sprints had turned into slow, careful walks. And Thomas, he too had changed. His body was weaker, his movements slower, but through it all, they remained together. Then, one winter morning, Thomas woke up feeling colder than usual. He sat in his rocking chair, watching the snow fall outside. Buddy was curled up beside him, just as he always was. But something felt different. His breaths were slower, his limbs heavier. He reached down, running a trembling hand over Buddy's fur. "We've had a good run, haven't we, boy?" Buddy let out a soft whimper, nuzzling closer. Thomas chuckled weakly. "I'm tired, Buddy, real tired." The dog didn't move. He just stayed there, his warm body pressed against Thomas's feet. Hours passed. The fire crackled softly. The wind whispered outside. And then, silence. A love that never ends. When Jack came to check on Thomas a few days later, he found the old man sitting peacefully in his chair, his head tilted slightly as if he had simply fallen asleep. And beside him, curled up at his feet, was Buddy. Both had passed quietly together. Jack stood in the doorway for a long time, his throat tightening. Finally, he whispered, "Goodbye, old friend." He stepped outside and looked at the sky. The storm had cleared, and the first rays of morning light stretched across the horizon. And if one listened closely, through the rustling trees and the whispering wind, one could almost hear the sound of a man and his dog walking side by side in a place beyond time. Because love, true love, the kind that never fades, never really ends. It just changes form. And somewhere, in a world beyond this one, Thomas and Buddy were still together. Forever. The end.